In June of 2018, Echuca's population was 14,934, with a further 6,308 residing in Moama. The evidence of its rich history still present around the town to this day. It is located in the indigenous Yorta Yorta country on the banks of the famous River Murray and the Campaspe River, just downstream of the Goulburn River. Tourism is now one of the area's major industries, alongside its hospitality and medical sectors. Visitors from all over are drawn to the area's rich history and its iconic paddle steamers, which played an important part in the town's growth via its pioneering in the river trade and its contribution to the nation's development in the 1800s. These are a collection of stories that make up the Echuca Moama history. For many years, the trails blazed by early explorers were followed by stockmen droving cattle across the country. One of these was James Maiden, who in 1840, during a drought, brought stock from inland New South Wales to a 120,000 acre cattle run on the northern New South Wales banks of the River Murray, now known as Perracuta Station. The station's lease was held by a relative, J. Clark, who employed Maiden as his superintendent. For Maiden, these were gruesome times. The station became known as the Slaughterhouse, recognising the violent clashes that took place between the settlers and the local Indigenous people. In his memoirs, James Maiden recalled being held under siege in his home. For weeks, his hut was surrounded and attacked day and night. Eventually, James had a small but very loud cannon built, which, from all accounts, served its purpose, scaring their attackers away without actually causing further bloodshed. It appears Maiden saw opportunity upstream, away from the Troubles, and in 1846 he established the first public punt further upstream at Maiden's Punt, which was renamed Moama in 1851, a word of Aboriginal origin meaning the place of the dead. Moama became an important river crossing and the first land sales were held that year. Maiden built an inn nearby and in 1848 had established a post office. The discovery of gold in Bendigo in 1851 led to a huge demand for meat. For several years, Moama became a busy cattle market centred around Maiden's Inn, making Maiden a fortune. Unfortunately, as gold petered out, the market collapsed and Maiden's fortunes plummeted accordingly. His punt was purchased by Henry Hopwood and Maiden left town. Henry Hopwood is widely regarded as the first settler and father of Echuca. He foresaw that the rapid settlement of the Riverina region would make viable the establishment of a township at the most suitable crossing location on the River Murray. He arrived on the New South Wales bank of the Murray around 1849 and was employed at a boiling down works where, without official approval, he put in a punt and built a rough inn. In 1853, Hopwood crossed to the Victorian bank of the Murray and gained a licence to occupy 1 square mile of land on the isthmus between the Murray and Campaspe rivers. The site was well selected and was known as Hopwood's Ferry, as he placed a small ferry or punt there. This area later became the heart of Echuca. The word Echuca is an abbreviation of the indigenous name of the locality, which is thought to mean the meeting of the waters. In 1854, Hopwood put up a punt of superior construction and later a pontoon bridge across the Murray below his Bridge Hotel, correctly anticipating an increased movement of livestock and commerce. Hopwood's enterprise resulted in Echuca rapidly rising into prominence as a river town. As his businesses grew, he purchased Maiden's Punt and retired it, giving himself a monopoly on the river crossing. Businesses of many descriptions were opened and the streets were surveyed. The Victorian government then provided Echuca with a post and telegraph office, which allowed the town to be connected by telegraph with Melbourne and Adelaide. In those early days, Echuca was supported mainly by the overland stock traffic, which in 1856 was valued at £250,000. Do you know, both these men were convicts, and both came from Bolton, Lancashire, in England, and both were charged at the same court on the same day in 1835, one for stealing and one for receiving stolen goods. Whilst these two men were building their empires, the South Australian government was attempting to cash in on the gold strikes and the commerce that came from the many people flowing into that area. They offered a reward to the person who could successfully navigate the Murray from Goolwa. At that time there were no roads of any sort, aside from the possibility of many winding rough bush tracks. While 2 boats started from Goolwa, only one completed the journey. The Lady Augusta later retired after reaching Swan Hill, while the other boat, known as the Mary Ann, completed the passage to Moama, which was known as the major settlement on the river in September of 1853. This proved the river was navigable, and thus began the river trade. Many paddle steamers were being built in Echuca Moama as a result, and with the influx of these vessels, a larger wharf was needed. The Echuca Wharf, built in 1865, the wharf is of great historical significance. Constructed from locally felled and milled Reva Ridgum, the Echuca Wharf is over 10 metres high. This allows for the variations of the winter and summer river levels, permitting goods to be unloaded all year round. Built as part of the Echuca Port Complex between 1865 and 1867, the wharf was originally 92.4 metres long, but was extended several times in response to the increased volume of river trade traffic. It eventually reached an incredible 332 metres in length, but was reduced to 75.5 metres during World War II. This is the length it remains to this day. During World War II, Melbourne experienced a shortage of firewood and timber for construction, and unfortunately a great source of wood came from the demolition of the Echuca Wharf, which helped alleviate those temporary supply issues. Port of Echuca, the largest inland port in Victoria and second only to Melbourne as a Victorian port, known as the Chicago of the South. Built in 1865 by the Victorian Railways, the Port of Echuca was crucial to Echuca's development. The Port of Echuca facilitated the movement of goods through Echuca from the Murray-Darling catchment. It was serviced by direct rail access with the construction of railway sidings adjacent to the Echuca Wharf. By 1877, 7 railway sidings were approaching the wharf. Cranes, wool presses and bond stores were constructed along the wharf's upper level to service the bustling paddle steamer trade. Over the 1870s and 1880s, river trade was at its peak, with the Echuca Wharf struggling to keep up with demand. In the 1880s, as many as 30 boats and barges would be seen tied up at the Echuca Wharf. Approximately 240 movements of boats through the port annually was straining the powers of the railway department in the process of unloading. 7 hydraulic cranes working day and night on the wharf to transfer the valuable cargo into waiting railway trucks. Scores of men in the railway yards, stevedores, dumpers, tally clerks and crane drivers assisted in shipping as many as 100,000 bales of wool, hundreds of tons of wheat and thousands of cases of fruit in one single year. Large quantities of chaff, fodder, hides, timber and liquors were also transported. In 1882, the river trade was estimated to be £5 million, a large percentage of which was wool coming into Victoria from New South Wales. In the late 1950s, there was a movement by locals to retain what was left of the wharf, and by the 1970s, the wharf was heritage listed and became a prominent feature of Echuca's story and identity. Various parts of the wharf and associated infrastructure have been renewed and or restored throughout the years. By 1861, 294 residents were living in Echuca. Whilst many of them lived in the main town of Echuca, there was a large group of residents living and working in what is now a bushland area. This was once a thriving small settlement called Banyula. Most residents of this flood-prone area were rivermen and poor workers of the timber and tanning industries and their families. With hundreds of workers and their families living here, they even had a Sunday school. Today, the bush has reclaimed this area, now known as the Banyule Forest in Echuca East. During the depressions of 1891 and the 1900s, many itinerant workers put up their tents and made the forest their home. The area begins just over the Murray River south of the Iron Bridge. Small homes were built of timber slabs or were more often just tents. It was a very close, thriving community which in the 1860s formed the Echuca East Rowing Club, which won many trophies. The club was eventually disbanded during the late 1930s. The site of Echuca East shipbuilding yards. Many of the Echuca fleet of paddle steamers were built at this slipway. Rails are still to be seen in the cutting that runs into the river. The original location of the Murray River sawmill, which had a wharf and tramway to the railway line. This was one of a number of mills in this area, which shifted to new locations after the floods in the 1870s. Shinbone Alley, a slightly higher section of land named after the area's unique shape when viewed on the map. This street development had homes all along it. However, even though it was located on higher ground, it did not stop it from being flooded. During floods, most residents attempted to relocate their possessions out of the reach of the rising waters and moved away, staying with friends in safer locations while the flood water breached their buildings. Many homes survived the 1870s flood, but in 1956 a very high flood caused the last of the area's residents to leave the area for good. Marks on trees show the height the water reached throughout the area. There were many businesses along the riverbanks, from boatyards and abattoirs and sawmills. On a high section in this area there was a row of houses, and if you look closely there is still an old fruit tree to be seen where someone once lived at that time. The Emu Tannery and Fellmongery. Sheep and cattle were slaughtered here. skins tanned and carcasses boiled down for tallow. A soap factory also formed part of the complex. It was all inundated and washed out in the 1870s flood. Overlooking the Maiden's Punt and Junction Inn site. James Maiden was one of the first settlers in the area, building his punt and inn around 1846. It was the first cattle crossing on the Murray River. This part of the bush is where a road ran around the river from Maiden's Punt to Hopwood's settlement and his new road inn. Parts of a brick road are still visible near the approach to Maiden's Punt. Gold mining at Echuca. The Riverine Herald on 6 April 1880 reported, "Gold mining effort at Echuca, shaft sunk 55 feet on the flats near Echuca sawmills." The Argus reported the shaft is being sunk by an Italian miner. A group of businessmen formed a syndicate and applied for a licence. However, water became a problem and the mine failed. The Echuca Historical Society has the company seal in their collection. Through this area ran a small but deep creek, the Southern Cross Creek, now with a pedestrian walkway bridge, which in earlier times also allowed for vehicular traffic. It was on this bridge that a local story evolves. The reluctant prostitute. Sometime in the 1880s or 1890s, a prostitute picked up two sawmill workers in an Echuca pub one night and allowed them to buy her drinks. Later, when the trio strolled along the riverbank near the sawmiller's cottage, the men suggested the lady should repay their hospitality with some free sex. The prostitute got on a high horse and told the men her company was ample reward for the drinks. If they wanted anything more, she said, they would have to pay for it. This conversation began to unfold as they were approaching the old tramway bridge over Southern Cross Creek. So the men suggested that if the lady did not cooperate, they'd dangle her over the bridge until she learned how to show her gratitude properly. Her mind was unchanged. No pay, no pleasure. So the men carried out their threat. It was then that things went horribly wrong. As she dangled over the water, her tight-fitting clothing bunched up around her neck, stopping her breathing. Her face suffused with blood and her eyes bulged. After some minutes, the men dragged her limp body back onto the bridge. But it was too late. The lady never again gave pleasure, with or without payment. The ghost of the prostitute would appear there when the moon was setting, just as it was when she died, waiting to take revenge on her unprincipled companions. The bridge was destroyed by floods in the 1920s, and she hasn't been seen since. Or has she?